Night has fallen, and the moon is a glowing golden orb in the black sky. See how it shines on the dark back roads of America, and on one road in particular. Come with us, and we'll take a walk down the moonlit road, for the night is waiting, and the moon is full.
The Moonlit Road presents Episode 2, Sleepyhead, written by Craig Dominy and told by Veronica Bird.
When I was a kid back home in South Alabama, whenever I would get real rambunctious and wouldn't go to bed, all my folks had to do was tuck me in and tell me about old Sleepyhead, that crazy old woman who could never fall asleep. Now that story could always make me go straight to sleep the minute the lights were turned out. The story goes like this. Many years ago, there used to be this old couple named Flowers who lived on a huge farm outside of town. Now, Mr. Flowers was a very prosperous farmer with bountiful fields and lots of livestock. Even in the driest months, that man still found a way to make lots of money off his land. And the more successful he got, the more the farm grew. Well, you know what they say about having lots of things. The more stuff you got, the more you have to take care of. Mrs. Flowers found that out the hard way. One hot summer afternoon, while working in the fields, her husband had a sudden heart attack and died, leaving the entire farm in his wife's care. Now, the couple had no children, and Mrs. Flowers didn't know the first thing about farming. She had always left farm business to her husband. Now she was all alone. Mrs. Flowers did her best to take care of everything, but soon it became too much to bear. The house became cluttered and dirty, the fields dry and weed-infested, and the livestock grew malnourished and skinny. What's worse, she became so consumed with what needed to be done that she couldn't sleep at night. She tossed and turned, making mental lists of what needed to be done each day and what bills needed to be paid. Mrs. Flowers tried everything to fall asleep. She'd take a hot bath, read the most boring book she could find, and count sheep in her head. And though she normally frowned on drinking, she'd occasionally crack open her husband's whiskey and make a hot toddy before bedtime. But nothing worked. She became constantly tired and listless, having very little energy to do her daily chores. Her skin turned pale, and her eyes were puffy and bloodshot. It got to the point where she was anxious about going to bed at all. Each morning, the crowing of the rooster and the piercing beams of sunlight coming through her window signaled the end of yet another sleepless night. Friends who called on her were shocked at her appearance and whispered to one another that she looked like walking death. So in desperation, Mrs. Flowers decided to pay a visit to a local conjure woman who lived in an old shack at the edge of the swamp. Perhaps she could come up with some sort of spell or potion that would help her sleep. Now, most folks were scared to go near her, thinking she was an evil witch. But poor, tired Mrs. Flowers felt that all of her other options had run out. So one afternoon, Mrs. Flowers rode down the long, boggy road towards the conjure woman's house. The dark, mossy trees seemed to envelop her as she rode deeper and deeper into the swamp. Black clouds of flies buzzed around her face, and poisonous snakes slid to and fro beside her wagon wheels. How could anyone live in this awful place, she thought to herself. After what seemed like hours, she reached the ramshackle cabin. The yard was barren and filled with all sorts of rusted junk. Sickly-looking chickens fluttered about, desperately pecking at whatever crumbs they could find. Looking at her eerie surroundings, she thought to herself that maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Nonetheless, Mrs. Flowers climbed off the wagon and hesitantly knocked on the grimy front door. There was no immediate sound from the house, and Mrs. Flowers, somewhat relieved that no one was home, turned to leave. But then the door slowly creaked open on its rusted hinges. Mrs. Flowers hesitantly turned around, and there, standing in the darkened doorway, was the conjure woman. She was an old hag with long, stringy hair that looked like it was made of spider webs, long, dirty fingernails, and a giant wart on her chin. She recognized Mrs. Flowers immediately and grinned widely, revealing 5 or 6 rotten yellow teeth. "How nice to see you," she hissed. "Please come in." She led Mrs. Flowers into a musty old room and motioned for her to sit in a dirty, overstuffed chair in the corner. Mrs. Flowers sat down and told the conjure woman all about her sleeping problem and how she would do anything for just one good night's sleep. The hag nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. She then returned with a dark vial filled with a syrupy-looking substance. "This will do the trick. It's made of cherry wine and wings of hibernating bats. It will surely put you to sleep, the soundest sleep you've ever had, and no one and nothing will be able to wake you until you are fully rested." Mrs. Flowers thought about it for a moment. Then she took the vial. Thank you so much," she said to the hag. "How much do I owe you?" The conjure woman grinned and waved her off. "It's my pleasure," she said. "Just enjoy your sleep." With that, Mrs. Flowers returned home and drank the bitter liquid. She cringed at the disgusting taste, but before she knew it, it became harder and harder to keep her eyes open. She staggered to bed and plunged into a blissful sleep, a content smile creeping across her face. Meanwhile, back at the swamp cabin, the conjure woman was biding her time. And after a couple of days had passed, she began spreading rumors throughout the community that something funny was going on up at the Flowers farm. Mrs. Flowers hadn't been seen in days. Had she finally succumbed to her poor health? After all, she had been looking more and more like walking death each day. But within a few days, a group of townsfolk paid a visit to the Flowers farm to find out exactly what was going on. They knocked on the door, but got no answer. Even though they could see her wagon was parked out front, they ran around the house, peering into every window, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Now very concerned, they picked the front door lock and searched the home. They soon found Mrs. Flowers upstairs, lying peacefully in her bed. They tried to rouse her, but to no avail. Her skin was cool to the touch. They listened for a heartbeat, breathing sounds, but nothing. They sadly came to the realization that Mrs. Flowers was dead. Friends in town cried at news of her death, but felt that maybe now she was finally getting the rest she so desperately craved. They laid her body out in the living room and sat up with her overnight, sharing memories of the times they had. The next day they carried her in a pine box to the old cemetery on the hillside and laid her in a freshly dug grave beside her husband. As the pine box was lowered into the grave, Mrs. Flowers slowly woke from her long sleep. You see, the concoction the conjure woman had given her had caused her breathing to become so shallow